the mystery that is the continued failure by democratic governments to invest more in smallholder farmers who are recognized as constituting the majority of the farming population on the continent. In a continent where the majority of the population have been systematically marginalized by policy and historical events, it would make sense, it was assumed that the advance of democracy would provide an opportunity for policymakers and democratically elected governments to redress the marginalization of smallholder farmers. But this has not generally happened, and as a result, smallholder farmers and the majority of the population of people in Africa continue to be marginalized and vulnerable. And in terms of analysis, there is tension from the different stakeholders and the interest groups as to the reason why the African agriculture crisis has persisted. And also, there's also tension around what are the kind of policy directions that should be taken, and also what is the reason for the weaknesses in the strategic decision-making around the issue. And to try and push that debate, we have assembled a very powerful panel of 4 experts drawn from Africa. And we have drawn the experts from policy, from research, and also from the donor community. And I'm going to introduce the panelists here. We have got Ms. Erica Maganga. She is the technical advisor on poverty reduction in the Office of the President and Cabinet in Malawi. Ms. Maganga is a former principal secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security for 4 years. She has vast experience in field work and has also interacted a lot with smallholders. Her background is in irrigation. This is Ms. Maganga. The second panelist next to me is Mr. John Barrett. He is currently the DFID's Chief Professional Officer for Climate, Environment, Infrastructure, and Livelihoods in the DFID's Research and Evidence Division. His recent roles include leading the DFID's team in 2010 Pakistan flood response and leading the DFID team that worked on the 2008 food crisis. And Mr. Barrett has spent over 15 years living and working in Southern Africa. Welcome, Mr. Barrett. And thank you for flying all the way from the UK to be with us today. Our next panelist is Honorable Chance Mbaye. Chance Kabaghe, former minister, excuse me, sorry about that. He's the former Minister of Agriculture in Zambia. He is also a former Chief Executive Officer of the Food Reserve Agency in Zambia. He is currently the Executive Director of Indaba Agriculture Policy Research Institute and also the regional, regional chair in the Agricultural Policy Research ESAI Institute. Welcome, Chance. Last but not least is Gaynor. He is an agricultural economist. He spent many years building Kenya's premier agriculture policy research institute, Tegemeo Institute of Egerton University. And at the government of Kenya's request, he was involved in writing key strategy documents and eventually moved to government to fast-track the implementation. After 3 years in government at the highest level as an advisor to the minister and the coordinator of a 10-ministry sectoral coordination unit, and a managing director of an ailing state corporation, he moved to the private sector, where he currently runs the agribusiness portfolio of the Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund, a $200 million fund investment in 145 companies in 21 African countries. Welcome, Kim. I will now give the floor to Ms. Maganga. She's going to say something about herself briefly, and then she's going to give us a PowerPoint presentation. After that, we are going to have an interactive debate with the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have 15 minutes, and I hope I'll be able to make this presentation within the 15 minutes that has been allocated to me. The introduction has been made about me, and as she has said it, I've worked in the Ministry of Agriculture for as long as maybe 15, 16 years. All my life I've been in the Ministry of Agriculture, from field level up to the policy level. I just want to give you a brief or background of Malawi before I start, but my presentation will be from the policymaker perspective. Background information. Yes, for Malawi. Malawi has a population of 14 million people. And we are predominantly an agrarian economy, with 85% of the population depending on agriculture for their livelihood. And agriculture contributes 90% of the country's exports. It also contributes 27% of the GDP. 70% of the food in Malawi is produced by smallholder farmers. And the smallholder farmers contribute only 20% of the exports, with 80% of the exports being contributed by the estates. We have a smallholder population of approximately 4 million people, and for Malawi, these are eligible voters. Our staple food is maize, which takes up about 80% or even above of the cropped land, and women are the main producers of food. Average holding size is very small. It is only 0.4 of a hectare, and we are not as highly mechanized as the other countries. Therefore, farmers use a hoe. And our main export crops are sugar, tea, coffee, and tobacco, and we attained our democracy in 1999. What's the impact of democracy on agriculture policies? In Malawi, policies formulation are led by government. And this is before democracy and even now when we are a democratic country. The only thing is that before democracy, when we were under one-party rule, the policies were being formulated by government with very little consultation on the other stakeholders, But now that we are in a democratic society, much as government leads in policy development or formulation, but other stakeholders are consulted, and these include the media, the academia, the donors, the farm organizations or farmer groups, the civil society, the private sector, but also other government ministries. For example, for farmers, they have so many groupings, livestock associations, tobacco associations, legumes associations, and many other associations. So these can initiate policy formulation in Malawi. Next page. And then, but then I think what you should note is that because of the consultation process, it also makes policy formulation a lengthy process. We have had policies that have been formulated as long as maybe 6 years, still formulating a policy because of consultations. And, but because of consultation, it is easy to implement the policies because all stakeholders are part of the policy formulation. And monitoring of the policies is also easy because all the stakeholders have been involved in the policy formulation. Now, because of democracy in Malawi, we have also seen that there's been proliferation of a lot of players in the extension services. Initially, extension in Malawi was being handled by government only. No other stakeholders would be allowed to be delivering extension services to the smallholder farmers. But because of democracy, we have seen the increased or the growing numbers of NGOs offering extension services. But because of the many NGOs that have come on board, we've also seen that the quality of extension has been affected. And the main reason is that most of the NGOs that are operating in Malawi, they have staff that are not well trained in delivering of extension services. And most extension NGOs are also too localized, and they are not transparent at times in terms of the financial resources that they have. But also, they have lowered maybe, because they want to deliver and they want to be seen to be performing, they have also introduced payment of allowances to smallholder farmers. So what has happened is farmers are not willing to attend training services unless they're being paid allowances. So it has affected implementation of or delivering of messages in Malawi. But again, democracy has also brought in a liberalization of the markets. At the moment in Malawi, initially we used to have only ADMAG that would be buying produce from farmers, and government would dictate prices, buying prices for the farmer produce. But with the democracy, we have seen a lot of more traders that have come out or that have mushroomed in Malawi. And much of these are offering a more opportunity for farmers as to where to sell their produce, but they have also brought in some problems. We have a lot of unscrupulous traders who buy the farmer produce at a very low price. And this affects the take-home of the farmers. And again, the most important thing for Malawi is also understand that for Malawi, the illiteracy levels are very high. And because literacy levels are very high, the understanding of democracy is very low, to such an extent that when you're implementing policies, farmers at times, they would think they have the right to implement a policy or not. There are some policies, for example, where at the end of the season, like a tobacco season, you want farmers to uproot the tobacco or cotton stems. But farmers can choose not to do that because they think it's their democratic right. So democracy has brought in that confusion where farmers don't really know what's their right and what's not their right. So it affects implementation of programs. Can you go to the next page? Anyway, on a positive note, farmers can now demand for services because there are many players, and farmers can go to any of the players, whether government or NGOs, to demand for services. But also democracy has led to the increase in numbers of players that are also able to supply inputs to farmers, and farmers have that opportunity to, or a choice to go to any trader to buy their produce. But also democracy has brought in a vibrant media, both radio and print, which are also offering a lot of messages on agricultural development. As a result, farmers are now able to access messages on agriculture development from either the print or the radio stations. Again, next page. And then I wanted to just comment on the issue of why investments in agriculture low. And then I was asking myself when I was preparing the presentation to say, are investments low in agriculture? I don't know. But the issue is, what guides investments in agriculture, for example, in Malawi? We are an AU member, and Malawi adopted and we are implementing the 2003 Maputo Declaration that urged all heads of states to allocate at least 10% of the budget allocation to agriculture. And Malawi has done this for the past 10 years. Agriculture allocation has been above 10%, and agriculture is actually number 2 to education in terms of allocation, budget allocation. And in line with the AU NEPA agriculture agenda, Malawi has also developed an agriculture sector investment priority plan, which is the ASWAP, which is aligned to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, but it is also aligned to our own country medium-term plan, the Malawi Growth and Development Strategy. And our ASWAP, the priority investment plan for Malawi, has been developed in consultation with all key stakeholders in Malawi. These include the academia, the private sector, farmers' union organizations, civil society, donors, and these are also a signatory to the compact that was signed when we were finalizing our investment plan. So they are part and parcel of the investment plan. So we all know the priorities. All key stakeholders are part of the priorities that government has developed. And again, we all know the gaps that we have in our priority investment plan. The political will, as I've said, it is there because of the allocation of more than 10% budgetary allocation. But I think the demand for agriculture development is so high that maybe we need, governments like Malawi need more support in order to fill that gap. But maybe the issue for Malawi is, much as the government is allocating 10% of its allocation to agriculture, how is that 10% utilized? You see that for Malawi, about 60% of the allocation goes to the farm input subsidy program because the priority for Malawi government is food security. And there are many reasons why our priority is food security, because we are landlocked. Importation of food can also be expensive. It can also drain a lot of resources. And with issues of climate change, we just need to produce food as a country. There are many reasons why government prioritized a farm input subsidy program, which means the balance, which is only 40%, goes to the other programs. And these include irrigation development, which is also key, human resource development to be able to implement programs, research, water conservation programs to deal with issues of climate change, but also extension development. All these activities use the remaining 10%, which is not maybe adequate. You all know donors. Donors, they at times choose areas of support, and much as they could be within the investment priority program for Malawi, but they may not, most of them do not prefer to put their resources to government so that we can use one program when it comes to implementation of programs. As I said earlier on, NGOs are localized and at times not transparent. So there is a lot of money coming into Malawi through NGOs, but this money, as government, may not know exactly how the money are being used. So on overall, government is trying its best, but I think the financial gap is too wide. Apart from issue of low investments, I think it is important to understand that there are more challenges in the agriculture sector than just financial resources. We are talking of lack of access to credit for inputs. There are no banks that would specifically give loans to smallholder farmers because they don't have collateral. And the interest rates for Malawi, for example, now, I think the interest rates are as high as 44%. That's too high for a smallholder farmer. Then we are talking of lack of or poor organization of farmers, no cooperatives, high literacy levels, understanding of farmers is very low, low productivity. For example, for Malawi, we are only talking of 2 metric tons per hectare of maize as compared to maybe 20 for other countries like South Africa. Poor marketing infrastructure and poor roads, low technologies due to poor funding in research and other challenges that we have. Next. Would democracy help more funding in agriculture? My answer is yes and no. Yes, because with increasing understanding of democracy, citizens are now able to demand for services from the governments. And even during the budgetary, when the government is preparing the budget, consultations are done with the rural communities on areas of priority. So farmers are able to influence. But I'm saying no because when you have limited resources, it is impossible for farming community or for parliament to allocate adequate resources to agriculture. The next one. The next one. How much influence do parliamentarians have on policy? In Malawi, the main influence is on budget allocation to agriculture sector. And the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture has an opportunity to engage government on policy formulation, implementation, and even monitoring. And when the bill goes to Parliament on any policy that the ministry wants to implement, the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture plays an important role in supporting such a policy to get through in Parliament. What are the causes of low state capacity? Low state capacity for agriculture policy implementation is inadequate finances, issues of human resources, and also inadequate resources for field staff to enable them implement agriculture activities. And then existence of state agencies in agriculture policies. Yes, the state agencies indeed exist in our settings where the technocrats might want to operate within clear rules and regulation. Or politicians would also look at what are they going to benefit as the politicians. And then how can donors effectively support and encourage formulation and implementation of policies that benefit poor households? First, I think it is important to note that I don't think it is in the interest of donors to impose policies on governments. Governments should form their own policies. And then, but we've had cases where donors influence or set up conditions on areas of support. But for our case, donors have an opportunity because they participate in the formulation. They participated in the formulation of the investment plan for Malawi. With that, I thought that is a good entry point for the donor community. The donor community participating in the formulation. And in our case, donors are part of the signatory of the compact, which means the donors are part of the investment plan that Malawi government has developed, but also the medium-term plan. Donors, for example, the farm input subsidy program medium-term plan, donors were part of the process of formulating that. And within the structure of the investment plan, donors, we also have what we call the sector working groups. That is also an entry point where donors, if they have any policies that they would want to influence, they could use those as the entry points for policy formulation. but also bilateral talks between donors and governments through several forums. That could also be an opportunity for the donor community to use as entry point for influencing policy formulation. Thank you very much.
I think what I got from there is that the Malawian government is doing all it can, and they can only do so much. She also talked about the fact that with the constraints that it has, the government has to make choices. And yes, while democracy has ushered choices, also increased people's capacity to demand services, there's some trade-offs. And I put about 4 of those trade-offs. The need to balance inclusive policy making versus expediency. You know, when you try and consult everybody, it takes a longer time. Also, the opportunities that democracy has brought in for diversification in agricultural support services to smallholder farmers versus issues of quality, governance, and consistency control of the services that the farmers can have. There is also choices that have to be made between opportunities for smallholder farmers to diversify market access versus issues of quality and governance and the terms on which these farmers can participate in these markets. And then she also made an interesting point about policy coherence, that I think at the beginning when there are few people involved, specifically the government and the donors, there's a lot of coherency, but as you decentralize it to implement, when you get to the level of the farmers, it starts to disintegrate. And one of the reasons was because of democracy again, because farmers now see policy as a choice, and also the failure to streamline government priorities with those of investors. Then there was also a trade-off between politics and the technical issues in agriculture policy making. And then she concluded by highlighting that the issues go beyond finance. So yes, the government is doing all it can, but there are also issues that have to do with the other stakeholders in the game of agriculture policy making. So without wasting more time, I think she said the hands are tied. Our next speaker is, we're going to ask John Barrett, who's representing the donors, to introduce himself and maybe by way of continuation, respond to some of Ms. Maganga's conclusions. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here. I've been asked to represent the donors, but I can barely represent DFID, let alone the entire donor community. But I am from a donor organisation, and as such, I'm perhaps the cuckoo in this particular nest, in that you are all very much frontline stakeholders in what is happening in Africa, and I'm now based in London. I did spend 9 years in southern Africa, in Pretoria, and then in Harare, before I went back to London in 2007, where I was given the job of being head of livelihoods in DFID, in our policy division at that time. And within a few months of being in that role, which seemed a bit obscure at the time, when agriculture and rural development was very much in the doldrums in DFID and more generally in the donor community, we saw the beginnings of the food crisis. And that was really my opportunity to be involved in something that I think is very relevant to this meeting, and why I am delighted to be here, because I genuinely think that what you are doing is so important. And if you're successful and effective in what you're doing, you will play a role in taking tens of millions of people out of hunger and poverty in Africa. I really think that what you're doing is that important. And let me set out why I think that's so important. when the food crisis happened, donors woke up to the fact that we had been neglecting the area of agriculture and rural development for 15 to 20 years. We had seen the decline in the share of overseas development assistance going into the sector down from 18%, I think is the commonly accepted figure in the 1980s, down to a low point of 4 or 5%, perhaps a decade ago. And a realization, even though there was a lot of debate about the numbers, you know, when the number of hungry people in the world crossed that billion figure, presidents and prime ministers around the world woke up, said, something's going on here, we've got to do something about it. So there was a tremendous renaissance of interest and energy around tackling food security, and I think it was matched very much by a renaissance within Africa of the need to tackle agriculture that had perhaps been a bit earlier than in the rest of the world, with the Maputo Declaration going back to 2003. But there was a tremendous energy, and my role working in headquarters, leading a small team, working at an international level about, well, okay, what do we do as an international community to try and reverse those decades of neglect, resulted in the commitment, I think it was eventually at the Aquila summit, of committing $20 billion from the G8 over a period of 4 years into the sector. Now, 5 years on, I say, well, where's that gone? How many of you can point in your own experience to where that money is going and what impact it is having? But it was actually a critical point in the sort of the landscape of agriculture and food security, because at least there was for the first time in, I think, ever, there was a commitment and a number and a target about doing something about hunger and seeing agriculture as an important entry point. And a lot of discussion, okay, we've got the number, what do we do with it? How do we spend that? How do we turn that money into food on plates and money in the purses of the women who farm across Africa? And the strong sense amongst the donor community was that it was really important to get behind, particularly in the context of Africa, although Africa isn't the only part of the world suffering hunger, to get behind the country-led plans. And I think consistently the main donors have all felt that the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Programme was very much the game in town. And we have tried individually and collectively to support those principles, which I think the AFC principles were adopted by one of the UN summits. But it's about supporting nationally owned plans and investments. That's what we say. Whether we always do it is for us to be challenged on. And I think part of the challenge has been to say, well, okay, if we've got that, now how do we translate that into action? So we've seen over a number of years progress towards developing CAADP compacts, CAADP investment plans, and donors effectively saying, well, we will support countries which are serious about tackling poverty and hunger. And that will involve, I think, the emerging consensus. It's not something we're imposing, but I think this is the consensus. Nationally owned plans that look at policy reforms as well as public investments. And that in shaping those policy reforms and those public investments, it isn't governments or UN or World Bank consultants who have to say what it is. It's about getting the stakeholders in the countries, including the private sector, including farmers' organizations, NGOs, everybody in the supply chain, as well as academia, involved in a public policy debate about what are the right policy changes that are needed to unlock agriculture and food production. Now, that's easy to say, as if somehow it was self-evident what the right policies were, or that there is some 5 things that we can do everywhere, and if we do these things, it will all be solved. But the reality is the agriculture sector, as you all know too well, is very diverse. It's very complicated, it's very political, and what works in one country doesn't work in another country. And what I've personally felt very strongly for a number of years is that we needed a renaissance in the public policy debate in the countries where this support is needed. It is you who are going to be some of the people doing the thinking and the provoking and the promoting of an effective debate. There are no simple, easy, obvious answers in many countries, and these things need to be negotiated and debated, but they need to be based on evidence, robust evidence about what works and what doesn't work, not ideological prescriptions of, well, we know what works. If we knew what worked, we wouldn't have so many hungry people in the world. So all power to your elbow, and I'm delighted to see you here today thrashing out some of these really intractable, difficult issues. And I'm really listening very carefully to everything you say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, with that response, emphasizing the diversity, the complexity, and the need for evidence-based policy making and implementation. With that, I'll ask our next panelist, who is the Honorable Chance, to give us an introduction and say some few words.
Thank you very much, Madam Facilitator. I will sit, and I'll explain why I have to sit. I've been a lecturer before at the university, and whenever I stood, it was like I'm speaking to my students. And when I became a politician and a minister, whenever I stood, I was talking to my cadres and voters. So the language changes. So normally I prefer sitting because now I'm talking to my colleagues, unlike the constituencies that I've always been used to. So allow me to sit and say a few words about how I look about ag development in this region and Africa as a whole. My background indeed, as given, I used to be a university lecturer, and I also coined or started or strategized on two initially very good programs, but they are now disastrous. I was the first chief executive of the agricultural marketing board called Food Reserve Agency. First chief executive, set up systems, had a small team. The objective was that ag marketing in Zambia should be private sector-led, transparent, and predictable. My role, therefore, was to make sure that I crowd in the private sector in ag marketing. I had only 32 workers. When I left to become a politician, that place now has over 600 workers. Total is taking almost 70% of government budget, heavily subsidized. So whilst the beginning was correct, that should only be keeping strategic reserves of 3 months, whilst if you have calamity as a country, then you can organize yourself in terms of the resources and also the time for the maize to come from, say, America or from South Africa into Zambia. We had a lead period of 3 months. So the idea was just keep 3 months strategic reserves. That's it. We were not a crop marketing institution. Now in Zambia, we have the Food Reserve Agency, huge institution. Total loss in terms of taxpayers, money at this point in time. Then I became a politician, Madam Facilitator, of the biggest constituency in Lusaka in terms of human beings. It's like the Soweto of South Africa. That's my constituency called Matero, for those of you who have been to Zambia. Then had the opportunity to become a minister of agriculture. And I was the first person to work on the farmer input support program. This farmer input support program, we sat down with the World Bank. It was part of the poverty alleviation program. We really were convinced that with this program, productivity would go up. We were very confident that poverty levels would be reduced significantly, And we were very convinced that we would, really crowd in instead of out the private sector. On paper, it was to be phased out. And also, as, in fact, we coined it, it was meant for vulnerable but viable small-scale farmers. Vulnerable in the sense that they were resource poor, but viable in that they were healthy and had some piece of land. So the whole idea was to trigger them to start really having the resources and, increasing their productivity and also using the technology that was required. Fantastic program. But today is a total disaster. Unfortunately, we politicians, and indeed, don't just blame politicians, even technocrats in the ministries do take advantage of such well-intended government programs. Not only in Zambia, but my experience, because I now chair RINAPRI, which is the Regional Policy Research Institute, of the regional institutes, we have, as we exchange ideas in Southern Eastern Africa, basically governments mean well when they design their programs. But I may mean well when I leave, and also the permanent secretary leaves, and other people, and they see a loophole where they can benefit. Wow, that's it, taken advantage. And it becomes so difficult. Once now the politician thinks that, wow, if I give them fertilizer, then I have a vote. If I subsidize, maize, I'll have a vote. It becomes extremely difficult. In Zambia, it's the same case. In Malawi, the same case. We probably don't have to talk about Zimbabwe. But definitely, we are in a very awkward situation where the civil servant and the politicians, both of them, are tangling. And to take it out is extremely difficult. I'll give us an example of our former president, the first president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda. Kenneth Kaunda had a very good program. With that time, we had marketing boards. These were again huge boards in the region. And because of the financial hemorrhage that this NAMBOD, National Agriculture Marketing Board, was causing on the national budget, Kaunda, with all his socialist principles, he had to kneel down and disband these huge institutions. I think what I'm seeing, Madam Facilitator, this region, we are now going back to those boards that we used to have in the 60s and 70s. And they are not producing the required results. In Zambia, for 10 years that we've implemented, the FISIP and FRI being in place, the poverty levels have not reduced. We are still at average of 80% poverty, incidence of poverty in the rural areas. So what all these investments, but poverty has not reduced. Malawi yesterday we learned exactly the same. Kenya exactly the same. The only good example, colleagues, maybe you already know, China is the only country that effectively, with their kind of subsidies, were so well tailored, and also a command kind of economy, they reduce significantly their poverty because of the investment. So we really have, maybe we should not condemn completely, these programs. Once well designed, well targeted, well monitored, and the right people in the system, then it will work. Otherwise, I know a country like Mozambique, they do not have these programs. Yesterday when I was talking, the other day when I was talking to them, I said, please be very careful. Be very careful, learn from us. We started well, but now we're saying, how best can we come out of this? The politicians will always take advantage. So are technocrats in the system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Kabaghe. Yeah, I think the politician took over the lecturer. No, so right. very interesting reflection from a man who has won and is still wearing a lot of hats. And without wasting any more time on this very interesting session, I'm going to give the floor to Gem so that he can also give us his own responses, experiences, and a brief introduction. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm a little bit unprepared because the format we had set up was a little bit different from what has come out. But I'll try my best while remaining seated. Nah, let me stand up. I have a nice shirt. Thinking on my feet in these few minutes. Okay, talking from the point of view of someone who's worked with policymakers for a long time. In December, the Kenyan president signed a piece of legislation repealing some legislation that was originally passed in 1907, which said things like an African holding a coconut within 10 kilometers of the Indian Ocean beach is assumed to have stolen it. So of course, these rules were brought in by the colonial government to make certain things happen. And the question is, why has it taken us 100 years to repeal them? Part of the legislative package included setting up marketing boards and controlled prices and regulatory agencies, and you can't move more than a bag of maize across district borders without license and permits and all kinds of political shenanigans that are part of the political economy of agricultural policy in Kenya. So Kibaki signed in December, and I was very happy. It was a process I had been involved in for over 10 years, which basically took 130 pieces of legislation and boiled them down into 5. One, to set up a regulatory agency, a single regulatory agency for the whole agricultural sector. One, to have all there was a pyrethrum board and a cotton board and a sugar board and a tea board and a coffee board, all with 7 board members or 10 board members, political appointees from all over, just reducing the number of people who are looking for these political appointments. We're also trying to reorganize. We have a tea research foundation and a coffee research foundation and a sugar research foundation and a Kenya Agriculture Research Organization, and also trying to merge these bodies into one so we can have some coherence. But the story I'm telling is that the agricultural sector ministry or ministries has really been a hotbed of politics from 1907 until today. If you're the Minister of Agriculture, you have a lot of power to appoint 452 people to political positions. And I think if you followed the Kenyan election, the current person we call the Vice President-elect used to be the Minister of Agriculture. And I was an advisor when he was the minister in the sector. And I think the difference between him and some previous ministers we had worked with, I guess I'd worked with 10 over the last 20 years, was I remember one Minister of Agriculture who said, I don't ever want to see anything about the ministry in the paper. Huh? So he didn't want history to remember him, and he didn't want to be in the newspaper, and he didn't want to make any waves. Just spend his time, finish his term, and go away. Then the difference was this current Vice President-elect, who I think wanted to be in the newspaper every day. Because, and his campaign, part of his campaign rhetoric is that he really worked and he really delivered. And he did. He'd be in the office at 6 o'clock in the morning. He'd go to Parliament in the afternoon. He'd come back in the evening. He'd leave at 9 in the night. And he really used the agricultural sector ministry to build his political profile, which I think has helped rocket him to becoming Vice President-elect. He was part of this move to update agricultural legislation because he used to wonder, you know, why many of the things that we as agricultural policy people wonder. And he came to a FAC meeting, sat at the back of the room, and actually listened as we talked about, I think it was fertilizer subsidies or something. And then basically came and made his presentation and said, you know, I've heard you guys, but you just don't understand politics. I'm going to do it, you know. Not necessarily, you know, I can't remember the detail of what he said. But an activist minister of being an activist in the Ministry of Agriculture is a very useful way of moving yourself to the next level in political power. But having said that, there are certain things that he used to believe in that with all the evidence I and other people was able to present to him, he just wouldn't budge on. So for example, having a strategic reserve where you put 40% of national production into the National Cereals and Produce Board doesn't make sense. It loses a lot of money, it only feeds the weevils rather than feeding people. And you show him the evidence, you show him the destruction rates, you show him the silos which are leaking, but you know, I think he had his political constituency and he had his idea, and despite 10 years of policy research, and I'm not discouraging policy researchers, but I'd say I used to be one and I'm no longer one, is that sometimes the way, sometimes when we think about the politicians from our own point of view, I think we really don't understand them. And maybe spending more time hearing what they really think in their minds will really help us to have a better dialogue with them rather than a dialogue with each other. In the 1 minute I have left, another thing I liked, I've been listening to people over the last 2 days talking about farmers. And I've spent many years interviewing farmers, and Tegemeo has panel data, 2,000 households over 15 years, every 2 years going back to the same households. And I came to realize that there are no, I don't know about, okay, I work in AECF where we work in 21 countries, and I've been to a few countries like South Sudan and Zimbabwe and Uganda, et cetera, et cetera. But in Kenya, farmers have voted with their feet. It's very difficult to find an agricultural person who gets more than half or 1/3 of their income from farming, even though they live on what we call a farm. And if you give him a choice between 10 bags of fertilizer, which is $500, and a motorbike, which is $500, he will invariably choose the, guess which one? Not the fertilizer that we spend years and years talking about. Because the motorbike makes the young people have something to do that they enjoy doing. You sit on the bike at the corner, you carry so-and-so here, and so at the end of the day you have $10. It doesn't mean that they won't farm, but farming will not be their primary activity. It's a secondary lifestyle kind of thing for most people. And I think it's actually quite a good choice. So I'm just saying, even I think the politicians recognize that people live on farms, which are homesteads, and they are farmers, but that's not how they define their life or their future. And I think as we think about the way rural Kenyans vote, and I think we've realized that Kenyans are, we don't vote based on, Kenyans pay like 2.5, 3 times the world price for sugar and for maize. And part of the problem for us as policy analysts who believe that by convincing politicians with data, 1 minute still, thank you. We try and understand, you know, how come Kenyans are not complaining about the high price of maize in this country or the high price of sugar? You go to the politicians from the deficit areas in maize and sugar and say, look, you're paying this much for sugar and maize and other people are paying this in other parts of the country. Politics doesn't work the way we think. And I think it's upon us analyst types to think more and understand where politicians are coming from rather than expecting them to listen more carefully to our wonderful papers and analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, the advice is that, what did you call it? Policy research types must try and understand politicians rather than trying to convince politicians about what you're trying to do. The first speaker has already given us an example of what happened in Malawi in terms of her view on the impact of democratization on agricultural policy making in Africa. I'm going to focus on that in this next segment of our discussion. I'm going to ask the panelists to respond specifically to what they see as the impact of democratization on agricultural policy in Africa. And as you can see, we have a very strong and experienced panel. I'm going to give each panelist 3 minutes to respond on what you think has been the impact of democratization on agricultural policy in Africa. I will just go through the same order, if that's all right with you. Are you ready?
Well, can I go last?
That's all right. Please, I'm going to be very strict with the 3 minutes.
I think the question from the facilitator is for us to say something about the impact of democratization on agriculture development in terms of policies in a given country. I think our first speaker gave a lot of detail. And that example really probably is true with many other African countries. Basically the same, the fact that the economies are open, the fact that people can discuss, and also the advent of this modern communication in terms of cell phones and what have you, and Twitter, and mention it, you know, there is more cross-fertilization of ideas and more understanding of what is happening on the ground, to the point that even as parliamentarians are debating, today people are tuned to their radios to listen and hear what they are saying in Parliament. That is starting to pay dividends. But I think they're also starting now, Madam, to appreciate the importance of quality data as a basis for policy advice. They don't just now say, oh yeah, he said, but what kind of data did he give? And that in this region is becoming more and more prevalent, which is really good. And all this has come in because of the democratization that we are seeing dawning in the region. So it is a positive, you know, thing that is happening. But also through this democratization, we have seen, Madam, we have seen a lot of policy research institutes, you know, are coming up in the whole Africa. And these are helping to properly analyze data and engage committees of Parliament on agriculture or economics or combined committees. And these really on the floor of Parliament, they are able to debate and really come out with very enlightened, you know, advice to the cabinet and indeed the, you know, the authority. At least I do know that that is happening in Zambia and is working very well. We have very quality data. We engage parliamentarians. We engage including State House. When we see that things are really going off tangent, we do that. And this is because of democracy. Before, they would just have said, that's it. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much. I think in my presentation, I must have talked a lot about the advantages and disadvantages of democracy. But I just want to focus a little bit on democracy and illiteracy levels for our farming community. And there have been times when you're on ground, when you're with farmers, at times you really at times wonder whether democracy is really helping our farmers in some ways. There are a lot of advantages, I've talked about them. But then let me give you an example. For example, when you have a technology that you want to give to farmers, or when you want to advocate for land conservation activities, you want all farmers to have marker ridges in their garden. You know, under one party rule, it will be compulsory. Government will just announce each and every farmer should have their gardens, have marker ridges to control water movement. They will do it. But in a democratic society, you can't do that because farmers will tell you, no, for my garden, I don't want to do what you're telling me to do. Even when it comes to technology adoption, you know, with the Farm Input Subsidy Program, as for Malawi, we have been promoting the Sasakawa technology. I hope most of you know it. Whenever you don't give them a coupon in the following year, they will tell you, I'm not going to implement the Sasakawa. I will plant 3-3, the old way of planting maize, which has low productivity. So at times you just look at democracy, and we hope maybe with time, democracy is really going to, or farmers are really going to understand what's their right and what is not their right, and maybe the importance of implementing some of the good policies that are going to help them. Thank you.
Okay, I thought I had talked a lot about democratization. I was actually done, but what would I add? Okay, democracy in Kenya is moving forward with difficulties. Sometimes we fight, sometimes we go to court. The politicians, I think, are hearing the voice of the people more and more, and it's true. In the old days, rules would just come down from State House, but now Parliament is on TV. The parliamentary committee is available to engage with. It's also becoming more and more on television, and they like to have good information so they don't get ambushed by the other side. The politicians we have are very wily, crafty people, you know. Everyone who won in the last election was always the richer candidate, and I think we spent a total of $400 million campaigning for this last election, where the winner won with maybe 4,000 votes out of 12 million. So we are really split down the middle, not on issues, but on tribe or whatever. What am I trying to say? Yeah, democracy, I think it's a work in progress. I think when I talked about the 100 years since the coconut thing was repealed, things are moving, but they're moving slowly. The one which focuses, I don't understand why people from my area don't mind paying 3 times the world price for their basic food stuff. So there's I think when teachers go on strike for a day, there's a lot of hullabaloo, and the government will accede to their demands and give them a pay increment. But if maize seed is bad, or sugar prices go up, or I guess rain is with God, if it doesn't rain, nobody makes any sound. People just, so I think farmers, okay, maybe because they're not farmers anymore, they don't make enough noise, but anyway, those are my garbled remarks. Let me pass the mic back.
If I passed the buck, or passed the mic at the beginning, it was because basically I thought, I don't know. And I think that still is actually my answer. I don't know whether or not it's making a big difference. But I think it's a researchable issue. One of the puzzles in the donor community is how can we tell where the policy environment is getting better? What are the metrics for telling? And clearly, the responsiveness of good governance to popular opinion is key to that. I'm aware that there's something called the Afro Barometer, which is a more general political survey that is done. And I've suggested to colleagues in different times and places that we need an Agro Barometer, something similar that looks at public perceptions of the responsiveness of government policy to popular debate. I think we have, with the World Bank's Doing Agribusiness report, something which takes a slightly different lens on that question about the responsiveness of public policy to public opinion or stakeholder opinion. But clearly the consequences of getting it wrong, I think, were reflected in the food riots of 2008, and it's definitely something that deserves more evidence.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. I would like to open the debate to the floor. I'm sure people are dying to respond and or pose questions to the panelists. Sorry, can I have a show of hands? I can see 2 gentlemen here and there. Nathan, can we start with them?
Sorry,
Good morning. My question is posed to my colleague from Zambia. South Africa has a very serious problem right now with the land redistribution and land restitution. Due to the historical imbalances and your land acts that has happened, we find ourselves in a situation where the most fertile land in South Africa is in the hands of very few commercial farmers. And government is struggling with land redistribution, not because of only finances, because the commercial farmers are not willing to let go of that fertile land. And also, government has issues because on the open market, the prices are extremely high. So in Zambia recently, there's been a lot of farmers from South Africa, commercial farmers that have been going to Zambia, buying up farms and thriving in food production. And there's actually a term in South Africa, they call it sweet deals. You know, they get sweet land deals, electricity, and so forth. Now, at this point, it might not be a problem for you guys because I believe there's a surplus of land. But if you consider that in the next 37 years, Africa will have to double its production if you look at the population projections, do you not perhaps see yourself in the same position a few years down the line that South Africa is in due to some land constraints? Should the electorate wake up one day and want those commercial land that is currently being given to foreign production capitalists? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Please, can you keep your questions short and to the point? Yes, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. This question is directed to the whole panel. I'd like you to sort of try and think around this. I'm a bit concerned because I haven't heard anything with regard to gender sensitivity to democratization and how it's affecting agricultural policy, especially looking at the fact that the effect of HIV and AIDS on the composition of the smallholding or sort of the smallholding household. You're seeing a situation where there are more female-headed families, more female smallholder farmers, and my question is, what is democratization doing for the female smallholder farmer? And what are your thoughts around that? What evidence do we have, or what can we refer to as saying this is how democratization has shown a sensitivity or as an interest towards, you know, the livelihoods and the experience of the female smallholder farmer in this current sort of light where livelihoods are being threatened by HIV/AIDS, there are more female-headed households, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a last question, and then I'll refer to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Anthony Chapoto. I'm from IFPRI, Ghana. I think mine is more of a comment than the question. Most politicians in Africa are businessmen. That's why they have the money. But once they go into government, they think that government has to give people everything and think that the private sector, they're the bad people. That's why you hear words like unscrupulous traders, they're bad people, but they are businessmen themselves. Why is that so? Then the other question, what do you think is the role of the government in agricultural markets? Is it these buying companies that they are setting up? And also, what is the role of government in ensuring that productivity is raised? Is the answer fertilizer alone? Thank you.
Thank you for those 3 questions. I'll ask the panel to take turns to field the questions, and then we're going to have another round. Thank you.
Great. Well, I've got the choice, haven't I? So I'll pick the one on gender because I think it's a very important issue and one that is very rightly raised. For DFID, and I think increasingly in the donor community, it's recognised that we need to see agricultural development that reduces poverty and malnutrition. And when we're looking at malnutrition rates, we should be particularly interested in women and small children, particularly children up to the age of 2. Undernutrition in those first 1,000 days from conception has lifelong prejudice on physical and mental well-being. It's just a tragedy that so many lives are blighted by malnutrition. And that should be one of the indicators of success in our agricultural interventions.
Thank you very much. There was a very specific question to Zambia, and I will fully respond to that one. It is true what you are saying, that indeed there are many South African farmers who are now totally domiciled in Zambia today, and they are really contributing significantly to the surpluses that Zambia has been producing in the past 4-5 years. But there are also white Zimbabwean commercial farmers who also really have moved into Zambia. True, Zambia has a lot of land, at this point in time, and the issues of grabbing, scrambling for land is not really an issue right now. It may truly, if we don't look at our land policies properly, 20, 30 years later on down the line, may become a problem. But I strongly feel that, as long as people are producing for the country and for export, you end up benefiting. It doesn't matter whether it's a local person or it's an outside person. But you have to do it in such a manner that really you don't maybe give very long leases, because that becomes a problem, because leases you keep on passing and becomes land for life. But if land is being used productively, personally, I don't see anything wrong with that one, because those very farmers are going to employ a lot of our small-scale farmers that I was talking about. They're on land, but producing nothing. So it's something that requires more detailed research work. Now, in terms of facilities, say they find it very sweet to be in Zambia. I'm not very sure. I think they have better infrastructure here than we have in Zambia. Suffice to say that a very good farmer here, very good farmer who practices zero precision in terms of farming and so on, that farmer, if he gets 6 tons per hectare here, then he's a damn very good farmer. If that farmer, exactly using the same technology, came and farmed in Zambia, or they come to farm in Zambia, if he gets less than 12 tons per hectare, using exactly the same technology, the same kind of seeds that he's planting, if he gets less than 12 tons per hectare, then something is wrong. The conditions in Zambia are definitely much better. These are natural conditions in terms of water, in terms of length of sunshine, and so on and so forth. Zambia has definitely better conditions, but not the physical infrastructure that the government has offered is definitely much better here. Now, let me also answer a bit a question that was to politicians, business people. Yes, I think the majority of them are, but there are many others who are not business people. True, it is not the role of government to be in business. And this is why things have gone wrong. Because immediately government starts dealing with business instead of regulating. You'll find that even our extension staff in the field, they would rather be there to do something on their side, get some fertilizer on their side. And though they start farming, they take advantage of the business instead of regulating. So Anthony Chapoto, I used to work with him. He used to be my research director. So those are issues that need facilitator, further research and debate. But government should never be involved in business because it will mess it up. Thank you.
I want to comment on the question on the role of government in agricultural markets. I think the role of governments is maybe to create a conducive environment for farmers to be able to operate, but not only farmers, but also other stakeholders like traders to operate in a conducive environment where farmers are able to market their produce and get maximum benefits from their production. I know that for Malawi, we, as per my presentation, because of the opening up or the liberalization of marketing, we've ended up with a situation where we have a lot of traders operating. And as I said, some of them are unscrupulous traders that offer very low prices to our farming community. By the end of the day, farmers don't make profits from their farming activities. And because they're not making profits, they are not encouraged to go back into farming activities. So as government, we've had to come up with a solution. And the solution was to introduce the minimum policy, the minimum pricing policy, which some have argued is not good, some have argued it's good. I know there are some countries that have the minimum pricing policy, but the idea is not for government to impose prices on the traders. But at times when you have challenges, you have to find solutions to the challenges that you have on ground. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment as politicians, as businessmen. In Kenya, we have a 5-year election cycle. And the average salary of a member of parliament is about $100,000. And the minimum budget to get elected to parliament this time was $500,000. So basically your 5 years parliamentary salary might get you back to parliament. So you have to you need money to feed your family. After you've gone to parliament, there's no other job you'll ever get. Some clever guys have managed to land on their feet. But the vast majority of politicians, it's the last job they'll ever do. And so every day of those 5 years in parliament, you're looking for opportunities to make money through business, through kickbacks, through contacts. Okay.
But just to say that Kenya has the best conditions of service for parliamentarians in the world.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to flag an issue with the panel before I take another round of questions. I hear a lot about the smallholder farmers and the markets, and actually one panelist referred to viable producers. And I want to ask a question about what about the non-viable, the farmers who are not in a position to produce for the market? Because it seems that that is the sector of the population that is most dependent on agriculture, and also most likely to fall through the cracks of these agricultural policies that are aimed at linking farmers to market as a solution. I will take the next round of questions so that we can then ask the panelists to respond to my question and the rest of your questions. So I'll ask Colin, your hand was up the last time. Do you still want to ask a question? All right, and then we'll have the lady behind him, and there, Jara, and yourself. Thank you.
I'm just reflecting on what Chance and what Gem said in their comments about democratization, and Chance perceiving that people are increasingly listening to what politicians say on the radio, and going even deeper than that and saying, and also wanting to know what the evidence is behind what they're saying. And that stands in quite stark contrast to Gem saying, well, but people don't even care in my home area that the world price of food is, no, the price of food is 3 times the world price. So those two are quite different reflections. And I'm wondering, well, particularly Chance, what your sort of, the basis for your perception is, and have we got an urban-rural difference here in perception? What's driving those very different views?
Thank you very much. Heike Hoffler from German International Corporation, GIZ. I would like to follow up on the thought from John Barrett in terms of how how to, the challenge about how to measure or monitor or prove that, that there's progress in agricultural policy making, or that there's progress in the way agricultural policy is implemented. And you were suggesting this agro barometer, or doing business reports for agriculture in terms of measuring perception on whether things have improved. But my question would be to the whole panel, do you see an opportunity in trying to nail that down more to some figures, for example, agricultural budgets, and the possibility of peer reviewing agricultural budgets with neighboring countries under a CADEP framework, for example, or whether that is something we can take up in the CADEP panel, or to compare investment plans or result-based initiatives coming out of the investment plans, whether you see any opportunity for that to measure how agriculture policy improves. Thanks.
Tom Dietz from Leiden, and I have a question for Erika Maganga. She criticized the NGOs for not being transparent, and that's a general criticism heard all over the place. There is a democratic deficit in NGOs. But what about the Malawian government? How transparent is it with regard to its agricultural policies towards the small-scale farmers, and how different is it now compared to, say, 20 years ago?
Thank you. Nicole Mason from Michigan State University and Chance's institution, IOPRI. The question's for Mr. Gameke. I appreciated your comment about, we should talk with politicians and try to understand their rationale for, continuing policies like the NCPB or the fertilizer subsidies. But I wanted to get some insights from you as to how we can get their true insights on these things and not kind of get the party line or, have them tell us what they think we want to hear. So if you have any suggestions on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, Mazubugo Jaha from PLUS. I'd like to find out from Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi about where does the most food come from? I'm asking this in relation to particularly South African food imports. I do not know if that's the case. The reason I'm asking this is whether actually agricultural policies deal with a situation where most food still comes from large producers. Is that the case? I do not know. The reason this is important to me is really a question about to what extent does, or rather do agricultural policies in each of the three countries really want to deal with that question? Because for me, if agricultural policy does not deal with that question, then there's still a huge yawning gap about the structure and system of production, in particular in any country. There's a particular case in South Africa where, as the colleague earlier had raised, that small farmer beneficial policy has to deal with the fact that most food comes from large producers in a system that benefits large producers. So how does the system seek to balance? How does the agricultural policy seek to benefit large producers who could be from within or from outside in comparison to small producers?
Thank you, Chair. My question is to John, but before I do that, if all politicians in Kenya were like the way Game describes them, I will not be here. But having said that, I just want to tell you that Kenyans have lost confidence in politicians. Nobody listens to them really, because they are the new comedians. And then government itself is also a comedian. You see that on TV, and nobody trusts them. And that's why I keep coming back to, how do we empower farmers? We need a revolution from the bottom, from the poor. And John, how do you make sure that what you fund truly has that indicator of reducing poverty and malnutrition? Because these are people who are voiceless, but they are the majority. And I think that's the only way we shall have any change. No politicians who use agriculture to do business, to make money. People are running to be politicians so they can do business. Government has no business doing business, and that's why they are selling parastatos. But politicians, and the political elites do business. So that's a huge contradiction.
Thank you very much for all those questions. Very interesting and diverse. I will ask the panel to quickly go through them. Please don't try and answer every question. Just pick some so that we can have time for maybe another round or two of questions and comments. Thank you.
Great. Well, I will answer the first and the last question, which I think are the same one, which was your question about what do you do about non-viable farmers. I think that agricultural policy is often blighted by falling between the two stools of whether it's about handouts or hand-ups. Very often the same kind of interventions are used in essentially a social protection context where you're supporting consumption of very poor, vulnerable people in marginal places, where really these are no-hope areas in terms of agricultural potential. Through a spectrum to where you're looking at high potential areas where you're seeing agriculture as the entry point for economic growth, where you're using the most fertile lands, the most privileged farmers in terms of experience and resources. And I think you just need to be very clear when you're designing a policy or a program or an intervention as to whether you have a social objective of reducing poverty and hunger, or whether you have an economic objective about stimulating economic growth and a wider trickle-down rationale. And the kinds of examples I would give, in Kenya, we have a very large program in the northern arid lands, which is explicitly about social transfers to very poor and vulnerable people. And there the policy issues are around, is it more effective and efficient to transfer agricultural inputs to people, whether it is fertilizers or seed or livestock, or is it more effective simply to give them cash? But it's about supporting consumption. And these are long-term chronic poverty issues that you're struggling with. And at the other end, I mean, over the just a bit further south, we're involved in Tanzania with the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor, which is very much around trying to catalyze private sector investment, economic opportunity. In the first one, in Kenya, the metrics of success is very explicitly about nutritional status of beneficiary households. In Tanzania, it's very easy to see the metrics in terms of economic growth, jobs created, amount of economic activity, but it's equally important there that we do monitor the impact on nutrition levels so that it's inclusive. You can have economic growth that benefits the rich, you can have economic growth that benefits the poor. The former is often easier to achieve than the latter.
Thank you, John. I'll respond to the question from Masaloka, a colleague from South Africa. In Zambia, and I do know that in Malawi as well, that the back of the staple food, and that's maize, is produced by small-scale farmers. In Zambia, we have a completely dualistic, very pronounced dualistic farming system. We have the commercial sector and the small-scale, farming sector. Now, the people who are more resilient and can adapt very quickly to changing, weather conditions are the commercial farmers. Supposing there's serious drought, the commercial farmer will immediately put his irrigation system in place, which is absent with small-scale farmers. So having both does work very well. But because also of our subsidy programs and so on and interference in the maize sector, commercial farmers in Zambia mostly will produce wheat, the soyas, the tobaccos, and mention. Those are the areas where there's very little interference by the Zambian government. So now, really coming back to your question, I know where you're coming from, because in South Africa, Madam Facilitator, I think it has been dominant, has been the commercial, farmers, and very little segment of the small scale. But I think, just like in Zambia, the most important thing is to make sure that small-scale farmers produce enough for their own household food security. If they are food secure, then you have solved a major problem for those small-scale farmers. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll try Colin's question and the one about how you get politicians to trust you, because the answer is kind of the same. When you have opposition in parliament and there's contestation in the parliamentary committee and debate, there's much more demand for data and evidence, and the opposition wanting to bash the policies of the government, you know, you're wasting money with your fertilizer subsidy, et cetera, et cetera. But in the last 5 years, we've had, you know, there's this tendency to form, you know, no opposition parliament in Kenya, even now, unfortunately. The other good thing about having an opposition is that eventually they come to government. And the most responsive politicians are the ones who are in opposition, because they want information to bash government. And I guess in the case of Kenya, we did manage to work with them when they were in the opposition, in the parliamentary committee. And when they did come into government, there was an element of trust, and we've been with together, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the bottom line is really about trust. I think the politicians are very skeptical and suspicious. And if you come branded with a certain message, like for many years we were branded as, since you're USAID funded, even before you start talking, we know what you want to say. You know, stop producing maize, and maize is too, blah, 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 blah. So they also pigeonhole people as you come towards them. And I guess the idea is, you know, how do you meet in informal settings rather than PowerPoint with people listening and waiting for the minister's reaction? And I guess being an advisor in the ministry, it helps, because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, 2 or 3 people will sit in an office and just chat casually, and sometimes you do get an opportunity to put in something, probably a fraction of what you'd want to say, but enough to keep, you know, put in a message without having the door shut on you in the future. So it's about trust and, I think, patience, and not having a pre-selected message which they're already expecting you to tell them even before you start talking.
Thank you very much. I think Honorable Kawai has partly responded to the issue of where most of the food comes from in Malawi. It's the smallholder farmers. As I said in my presentation, about 80% of the food is produced by the smallholder farmers. Estates produce maybe just 20%, because food maize is not a viable business in Malawi. Most of the states are engaged in cash crops like tobacco, sugar, tea. Those are viable crops, or even legumes, or seed maize, but not food maize. So most of the food in Malawi is produced by the smallholder farmers. On the issue of transparency on the NGOs, I think in my presentation I was clear to say that in terms of funding to agriculture, as Malawi, I think we are benefiting quite a lot from the proliferation of the NGOs that are currently in the country. But it's a fact that most of them, or some of them, are not transparent in the way they use up their resources. But as government, I think in terms of transparency in the way we are doing business, I think with time and with democracy, government is opening up. And as I said, I think with the development of the, or the formulation of the priority investment plan under the CADAP compact, I think that was the beginning of government opening up and working with the all stakeholders, because this plan, initially, government would come up with their own budgets and they would not involve any other stakeholders when coming up with those programs. But now, it's not possible to just come up with the program as government. We work with the all stakeholders, including the donor community themselves, the civil society, the farm organizations. They would have to know what are the priorities for government. We need their input when we're developing all those plans. So to me, that's the beginning of government opening up and being transparent with all stakeholders in terms of its operations. Thank you.
Did I answer what? There's one on the card.
Siri, thank you for those questions. There was not enough time for the panelists to go through all the questions, but I will just take the last round, and we will get the panelists to attempt those and the questions that they didn't manage to answer in the last round. I'll have the gentleman at the back and the lady, and sorry, yourself, and yes.
Thank you very much. Adi Olomola from IFPRI, Nigeria. Now, the issue of competitiveness is addressed by the Honorable from Kenya when he alluded to the fact that the prices of some commodities are about 2 or 3 times higher than the world price. Now, my question is this: how do you address this lack of competitiveness in the agricultural sector through the policy-making process in Kenya? My second question goes to the panelists in general. I observed that in a democratic setting, checks and balances between the legislature and the executive is a very key pillar. But now, from what we are hearing, it appears that the executive tends to monopolize the policy-making process. My question is this: to what extent is the parliament involved in the agricultural policy-making process in our individual countries? The third and final question relates to also the Honorable from Kenya that seem to conclude that what we need to do now in the policy-making process or in the analysis of the policy impact is to understand the politicians more, and just our policy research may not mean much if we don't really understand the politicians. But I think that over the years, the politicians are fully understood now in Africa. They have been so characterized, even in this gathering, you know, business-oriented, self-centered. Now, if they reject evidence-based policy advice, and they rely on their whims and caprices, how do you think agriculture can make progress in that kind of setting? Thank you.
Thank you. Anne Medicare, Aarhus University. I have a question for Jem, who about ministries of agriculture in Kenya usually being hotbeds of politics, as you said, and because primarily also of appointment powers. But I would like you to expand a little bit on that. You know, you mean compared to other ministries, it's especially a hotbed, and also, is it unique to Kenya, or do you think it's so in other African countries? Thank you.
Kwajo Asensochre, IFPRI. How do you see the African peer review mechanism as a vehicle for improving governance in agriculture, getting the voiceless to get a voice, and making sure that the policies are good and other things? And how can you get African countries to sign on onto the APRM? My second question is on the Malawi. You said the middle people go to these villages, buy foods at very low cost, very low prices. Don't you see these people as playing a major role, major intermediary role in linking these farmers to the markets, where perhaps they wouldn't have done if the people didn't go? These people go through very serious and dangerous situations to get to these farmers to buy the produce from. Now, with the advent of mobile phones and the other things, these people have access to the prices in the urban centers. So they know what is happening. Perhaps the major constraint may be road infrastructure. Why don't we make sure that we link these farmers directly with good roads so that they can send their produce, maybe perhaps directly to the markets, and improve upon their prices?
This is Regina Bierner from University of Hohenheim. Thank you for very interesting thoughts. I have a question to the Honorable Chance. It was very sad to hear this story, how a strategic reserve set up with the best of all intentions finally got politically captured and subject to all governance and mismanagement problems. And I think that reflects on a broader problem that many of the institutions that are set up to support smallholder farmers are very prone to this kind of capture and governance challenges. I would be interested to know, what is your conclusion? Should we even never set them up because it can't be handled? Or are there any strategies that could overcome these problems? What kind of political incentives could be created that they run more effectively, especially in a democracy where maybe this challenge of capture is even bigger? So what could be done to overcome this problem?
Thank you very much for this last round of very provocative and challenging questions. I'm going to allow each of the panelists a maximum of 3 minutes to say something in response to the questions that have been posed. But also, I would just like to encourage you to say something about policy-making practice, agricultural policy-making practice in a democratic state in Africa, that in your experience has either worked and or has shown potential, something that you would like to flag for the researchers here to pick up and investigate a bit more. Thank you.
Having last worked in Africa some 6 years ago, I think my examples would be probably a bit dated, but I can give sort of the more personal example as a civil servant. I mean, I do recall from when I worked in this area the need to invest in the capacity building of parliamentary committees and promoting political debate about agricultural issues. One of the problems is that every 3, 4, 5 years, Parliament changes and all these people that you have trained and engaged move on and do something different. So it's a constant challenge. The key issue, and one that we face in our own government, is the need to have a strong underpinning civil service that is capable of advising ministers and Parliament about the evidence of the political decisions that they're considering. It is entirely right and appropriate in a democracy that politicians determine the policy, but it is equally important that they do so with access to the best available evidence and advice about what the implications of those policies will be, and that needs to be done in a transparent way.
I'll attempt to answer 2 questions, if you don't mind. I'll start with my sister from University of Lund. I've been there before. A very good question. And I think, colleagues, all of us who are here, that question is extremely important in terms of where we're coming from, where we are, and where we are going with these programs. Because they're the ones, Madam Facilitator, that have really distorted and skewed our agriculture budgets in the region and Africa as a whole. And even if we have our CADEP in place, NIP in place, if issues, what she's talking about, are not well addressed, they'll all be a waste of time. Now, she says, what then should be the way forward? I can just give you 3 basic ways forward. The first one, as I said earlier on, at the drawing board, let us make this program very lean, very lean. And we should, within that program, put a mechanism, invest for monitoring and evaluation. That's number one. Second one, really this one I got yesterday from the Indian presentation. Those of you who are here, I did even ask the question from the Indian delegation. You see, don't leave the program totally under government doing it. What government did in India in terms of subsidizing, you know, they had a line of credit through a commercial bank. And all that they did, because the interest rates were very high, they had to subsidize a component of the interest rate, but it was done commercially. A small-scale farmer will go to the bank, he will borrow money. And maybe, unfortunately, this is why we've had these suicide cases we're hearing in India. Maybe it's because of this. But I think it's a better strategy than where, at the end of the day, we just waste, you know, the funds. The third one is really the social cash transfers. You know, many of these, they just need some social cash transfer. And you really have it. I do know that our vice president, I think we're probably the only African country in this part who have a white vice president. He said, we are wasting so much money in this. And what about if we decided that all these small-scale farmers, we just, instead of we spend, say, billion, say we spend 20 billion, we say, let's just give them free money, 10 billion, do whatever you want. You know, you reach that point. So the issue, coming back to the issue of social cash transfer, thank you, Hans, he's clapping, that makes sense. Really, once you go to the data, Madam Facilitator, you'll find that's even better to do that than the way things are. But let us be very cautious. We need more investigation in this area. Thank you.
Okay. The question about the power of the Ministry of Agriculture. As I mentioned, we have there's a commodity board for almost every crop, financed by a cess on the producers. And every year the crop comes and the cess is collected and the board is there. And you know, agriculture, I think, is the goose that keeps on laying eggs. If you're running a government hotel and it goes under forever. But agriculture, each year, you know, coffee comes through, maize comes through, and really the power to appoint 42 managing directors and 450 board members is a really, I think, other than the Minister of Local Government, who has the authority and power to go everywhere in the country, doing, you know, you do your Minister of Agriculture speech from 10 to 11, then you're meeting the local people and discussing. The other guy who can do that is the Minister of Agriculture. First of all, he has an army of 8,000 extension officers. In every sub-location, he has people who he has the right to go and visit and spend time with, who are implementing programs in contact with the people who are potential voters. So I think the Ministry of Agriculture is a very powerful ministry. I don't know how it compares with other countries, but in Kenya, I think it's after the Ministry of Finance and maybe local government, it's a plum one if you're a person on the way up. In terms of bad politics and what we do about it, I think, yes, improving the quality of the civil service and then making it not so permanent as it is now, because the bulk of civil servants are, with all apology to those here, the bulk of civil servants are kind of permanent, you know. To fire them for non-performance is almost impossible. It never happens. To fire them for for them to take a risk and say, Mr. Minister, this is a very bad idea. It's almost impossible for a civil servant. With all the training and everything in their back pocket, they just can't do it. I remember sitting in meetings where all the directors and whatever senior officers of the ministry were behind me, but it was like, okay, now I was on a consulting assignment, so even if I was fired, I'd still be comfortable. So I could speak, but you know, these guys would be behind me saying, yes, tell him. Because they know it, but they can't say it. Oh, you stopped me. The final one on the Africa peer review mechanism. I think benchmarking is a very useful thing for two things. One, in terms of how to reduce the cost of production. People don't realize that we are paying more than other countries for foodstuffs. People don't realize that our seed is more expensive or our fertilizer is more expensive. Even though the information is there, it doesn't come out enough. And I think even the Africa peer review mechanism, they come and they talk about stuff, but I think they don't really give us competitive juices. You know, when we hear that Rwanda is doing better than us in X, Y, Z, then we try and work a little bit harder to get on with it. So I think more noise from the peer review mechanism is one way of helping our farmers to know. Some of the things that agricultural private sector would want to do in order to reduce cost of production. You find a seed company that can't get its seed registered because of some regulations that were set up 50 years ago. You find that people are unwilling to invest in maize drying, etc., because it's too risky. You'll be competing with the government, which may or may not buy maize next year. So really getting the government out of the way, encouraging the private sector instead of demonizing them, maybe celebrating people from the private sector is part of the way I would want, from a technocratic point of view, to reduce the cost of production.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Maybe just to comment on two issues. The first one was the suggestion to link farmers to markets by providing maybe information on market prices and construction of roads. I think for Malawi, we have done quite a lot on providing information with farmers on prices through the commodity exchange. But also as government, as I said earlier on, we set minimum prices, and the farmers we normally announce on the radio, on the in the print media, to announcing the minimum prices. But then, when you go on the ground, this farmer is a vulnerable person. At times, he's desperate for money. For example, for Malawi, period between November, December, January, it's a lean period when farmers don't have food in most cases. So when the season starts in April, all that the farmer wants is to sell the produce. So they would sell at whatever price they wouldn't mind. And the problem is, these farmers operate as individuals. They're not operating as cooperatives or in groups. As a result, traders take advantage of them because they just go to an individual and say, can I buy at so much a price? And then the farmers will sell the produce. Just wanted to comment just one sentence on the social transfers. I think it's a good idea to talk about the cash transfers. But the challenge would be targeting, just like we have had challenges in targeting for the farm input subsidy program. When you go on ground at field level, especially for Malawi, where we don't have IDs, up to now we don't have IDs. You know, you can have a person with 3 names. I can be Erika Maganga today, tomorrow I'll be Napiri, tomorrow I'll be somebody else. You don't have an ID. So it is very difficult to target the beneficiaries of such programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all these interesting responses. I am sorry we didn't have enough time. I'd like to encourage that we have this debate at tea time and beyond. But I would like to just to say the takeaways from this session about this challenge of policy making and democratization is the need to acknowledge and deal with the complementarity, the trade-offs, the context specificity, and also the whole complexity within like a ministry, within a country, and within a region. And having said that, then there's a need for more policy engagement at the various levels, more capacity building, and also for lessons that have been learned to be used in a more effective way to inform policy making and decision making. Once again, I want to thank our panel, John Barrett, Honorable Chance, Jem, and Ms. Maganga for coming to this session. And just to make a plea that as FSC goes forward and researchers are doing their work, that we would like to urge you to continue to keep your doors and your emails open so that we can continue to learn from your first experience. And thank you everybody for coming to this session. We will now break for morning tea. Thank you.